Kia ora, I'm Jane Kelsey. I'm in my day job a law professor at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and much of the rest of the time I spend engaging with civil society and activists as well as with governments on the new buzzword in the trade arena called electronic commerce, as well as other issues such as investor-state disputes and so on. As someone who's been following the mega agreements of recent times, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, I've been trying to decode for people what the new global rules are that countries are being coerced into signing up to, not really understanding what they mean. And those rules are basically devised by and for big tech and are designed to get governments voluntarily to sign away their right to regulate the digital domain and to give free rein to the first movers such as Google, Amazon and others, and consolidate their oligopoly over the whole of the digital sphere. So we're working to get people to understand this, then to resist this, so that we keep the space open to be able to understand what's happening and then to regulate in the interests of social justice. The first important step is to get people to understand what the game plan is that's being played out in the trade arena. And people hear the word trade and they turn off, and that's actually part of the game. The game is to have the global rules for the digital domain made in an arena that is secretive, that is exclusive, that is solely concerned with commercial interests, and then to present that as a fait accompli when they weren't prepared to have those discussions in other arenas where there was a more balanced approach and where there were more participants who could argue in the interests of people, the interests of human rights, the interests of social justice. The term trade is being used as a Trojan horse through which to push rules that will regulate the entire digital domain. And so we saw those first with the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, but we actually didn't see it until the agreement was done, because that was one of the very few chapters that wasn't leaked. Had we had a leak, then we could have mobilized around it, as we did with the intellectual property chapter and the investment chapter. But the first we really knew about what the game plan was the so-called Trade and Services Agreement, or TISA negotiations, where there was a leaked text from that. And we started to analyse and saw that it actually had nothing much to do with real trade as people understand it. It was effectively a mixture of monopoly rights over data and intellectual property, rules on spam, rules on data to enable the big tech companies to move and hold data wherever they wanted, minimise privacy protections, minimise consumer protections, and so on. But by the time we found this out, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement had been concluded, and then we started to discover the same text appearing in a whole pile of other agreements. The Japan-EU agreement, Japan-Mongolia agreement, the EU's proposals to Mercosur, and so on. The EU had a fetish about privacy, but the rest of it was basically the same. And then we started to see that from 2016, the US was leading the charge to develop genuinely global rules based on the TPP template in the World Trade Organization. And that's been a big fight now that we've had for the last couple of years. There is no mandate to negotiate them, but a bunch of countries have decided they're going to break away and do it anyway. And engage in what they call 21st century rulemaking. And the dilemma, of course, is that if we don't fight this and defeat this, along with a number of the developing countries that are trying hard to do so, then by the time we really understand the implications of what's happening now in the digital domain, and then we see what happens in the next 10 or 20 or 30 years, governments are going to have signed away the right to do anything about it. Well, one of the strategies that we've been using to resist this in Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I come from, has been to challenge these agreements, in particular the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, before something called the Waitangi Tribunal. In our country, we have a treaty signed in 1840 between Indigenous Maori and the British, and the Maori version says Maori retain control over everything. And the English version says the British get sovereignty over everything. And there is this tribunal now which is established to look at breaches of this treaty, some of them historic, but also contemporary. And so the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement challenge had a first phase, and we're now moving into the second phase. And one of the key arguments in that phase is that the failure to protect Maori data sovereignty through the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and subsequent agreements is a breach of the Crown's obligations to Maori. And the fundamental argument, and I'm not Maori, but I'm involved as an expert in the case, the fundamental argument is that these agreements treat data as a commodity, as something to be decontextualized, to be traded in a marketplace which in theory is neutral, but in reality is dominated by the oligopolies of GAFA. From a Maori perspective, if you just look at data, data has what is called a mauri, or a life force. It has a wairua, it has a spirit, it has a whakapapa, it has a connection to people and to the natural world. Data is intrinsic to Maori identity. You cannot separate data from those to whom it relates, from whom it is generated. And once you start seeing data as a taonga, or as something that is to be treasured, that is precious, which the treaty guarantees Maori full rights over, then there are rights that attach to it of kaitiaki, of guardians of that data, of how it's used, of protecting the values and the interests and the people to whom it relates, but the validity, intrinsic value of the data itself. But also tino rangatiratanga, authority over the data, the right of Maori to control the data that relates to them in a cultural and a spiritual sense, but also in a developmental sense. So Maori can use the data to advance their own well-being. And so we will be having this argument later this year before the Waitangi Tribunal, and the government simply does not know what to do with it. It pretends it does not exist because we have this fundamental clash of paradigms. Its view is, oh, can we find a little sentence or two to slot into the chapter that can solve the problem? And no, the problem is a fundamental conceptual clash, which is intrinsic to the broader debates that we're having about conflicting paradigms involving the digital domain. At the core of this conceptual clash is this notion of how we relate to phenomena. So the trade agreements or the broader notions of rights over data in a market sense treats data as a commodity and something that can be owned. Māori are fundamental that in the understanding that there is no right to own. There is no exclusive domain that allows the extinguishing or the exclusion of access to data except for purposes of protecting its own integrity and value. And that is something that we find all the time when we are dealing with negotiators who don't understand that it's a first principles problem. It's not how can we accommodate these concerns within the framework of the agreements. It's the agreements themselves and their fundamental premises that are the problem. One of the lessons that some of us who've been around for a while have learnt is that we have had victories. And victories have been because people have mobilised. For example, the Trade and Services Agreement, TISA, was defeated in large part because there was huge mobilisation in the various countries, including the European Union, but also countries that started to see that everything now was being called services. And that includes manufacturing and industry, agriculture, and of course the whole range of public services. And so when we come to the digital sphere, we see several levels emerging where these trade rules cut in. Some of them are actually about the digital infrastructure. So source codes, data, where servers are held, spam, payment systems, e-signatures, and so on. And that affects digital industrialization as well as privacy, human rights, potential abuses through profiling and so on. But we also see that the ability to control data and to control the entire ecosystem gives control over what is now highly digitized agricultural and food production systems, or over industry which is highly splintered into lots of digitized operations, or mining or fisheries. It's almost impossible to think of anything now that isn't in fact driven by the digital technologies. And so all of the agreements are now interlocked together, and people who are workers in a particular sector or small farmers or fisher folk cannot now just think that it's a trade issue about tariffs or other trade rules as they used to know it. The digital fight is now at the core of the 21st century trade agenda.